quality content on Russian poll mill matters from some of the brightest minds in the Russia Watcher community. As always, veterans of Project Connect are going to recall that these are always on class, of course, and we keep it below the level of FOUO. And for the new folks, Russia Strategic Initiative, RSI, we are here to inculcate a common understanding of Russian strategic decision-making and its way of war across the DoD in the effort to minimize risk of miscalculation. In general, we are here to help generate peace for the department. Now, our guest today is Brian Whitmore. He comes back 2 weeks ago. If you joined us, you may recall he presented us with the contrast between Western and Russian mindsets, the idea of playing with the rules versus playing by the rules. Now, more intriguing was the essential and foundational picture of how the Kremlin operates. And he describes this in a word, systema. Now, to me, I take that to be a very mafia-like way of running the country, particularly pronounced as you get closer to the seat of power. And today, he's going to take us a step further into this system and examine what might be described as a systema toolkit. And his focus is going to be on the deadly influence of weaponized corruption and organized crime. Really quick about Brian. He is the director of the Russia program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And before joining CEPA, he was the senior Russia analyst at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. He also worked as a foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe in Moscow and Prague, and as a graduate instructor in the Department of Government and International Studies at the University of South Carolina. He was also a visiting lecturer in the history faculty of Mechnikov National University in Odessa, Ukraine, and international relations faculty at St. Petersburg State University. Hey, you can also catch him as the host of the Power Vertical podcast, which he co-hosts with Don Jensen. This is great, Brian. I listen to it every now and then as I'm commuting to work on my bike, and I thank you for the content that you and Don put out. The most recent episode, folks, is Infodemic Response on how the West can counter disinformation in the age of coronavirus. Brian, welcome back. Over to you.
Thank you, Phil, for that very kind introduction, much kinder than I probably deserve. And thank you to UCOM and to RSI. It's truly an honor to work with y'all. As Phil noted, this is kind of a sequel to the talk I gave 2 weeks ago, which was called "The Spoiler: The Domestic and Systemic Roots of Russian Revisionism." And in this talk, in the next 30 minutes or so, I want to kind of take you through a couple of the tools in the Kremlin's toolkit. Certainly not all of them, but the tools of organized crime and corruption. So if we could move to the first slide, I'll get us rolling. Okay, yeah, the dark side and sinister side of globalization. Effectively, we misread globalization. If you look back to the early 90s, I was one of those young and optimistic people in those days that really thought the world was changing for the better. We thought that globalization was going to spread liberal values across the globe. And in fact, it has to a degree, but it's also spread some very illiberal values. And to start off, I want to just give a quote, start with a quote from my very good friends Peter Pomerantsev and Michael Weiss from their 2012 study, The Menace of Unreality, How the Kremlin Weaponizes Information, Money, and Culture. Anybody who hasn't read this report, I highly recommend it. And I'll start with a quote, and I'm quoting now. If the premise of the neoliberal idea of globalization is that money is politically neutral, that interdependence will be an impulse toward rapprochement, and that international commerce sublimates violence into harmony, the Russian view remains at best mercantilist, with money and trade used as weapons and interdependence as a mechanism for aggression. Very prophetic words. Like I said, we got globalization wrong. We thought it would spread liberal democratic values. It has, but it's also spread very illiberal values. And I would go even farther. I would say that Putin's Russia has weaponized globalization. And two of the tools that it's used to do so have been organized crime and corruption. So I'll go into a brief discussion of how they do that with each of these tools. If we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, Russia's shell games. Corruption is not a bug in the Russian system. It's a feature. One of my favorite Soviet era jokes was about an official who got caught for corruption. He got caught with his hand in the till, he got caught stealing, and he was sent to prison. And one of his colleagues says to another, "Why did they pick on him? Why did he go to prison for what everybody's doing?" And the second colleague said in Russian, he said, "No, он украл не по должность." He stole out of proportion to his official position. He took too much. And I think this joke, as jokes often do, points toward a very important truth. And that is that Russian rulers in general, and the Putin regime in particular, because the Putin regime has taken this to an art form, have historically used sanctioned corruption as a tool to control the elite. Officials are permitted to seek rents, they're permitted to monetize their official positions so long as they remain loyal. If they are not loyal, well then, as a result of all of this corruption that they were permitted to do, they're very vulnerable to prosecution. So you have the carrot of corruption and the stick of compromat. And this has been a very, very effective tool for controlling the Russian elite. Now, in the age of globalization, Putin has taken this international. So by ensnaring foreign officials and foreign business people in the corrupt and opaque web of business, of shady business deals that emanate from Russia, the Putin regime has created this ready-made lobby in the West. It's the use of corruption, and I want to cite from my good friend Roman Kuczynski, the late great former director of RFERL's Ukrainian service. This was Roman testifying to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee back in June 2008, and Roman says, and I quote, "Gazprom, with the silent support of the Kremlin, has set up 50 or so middlemen companies, silently linked to Gazprom and scattered throughout Europe." He adds that these fronts, quote, do not add any value to the price of Russian gas being sold on European markets, yet they earn enormous sums of money, which appears to simply vanish through shell companies in Cyprus and Liechtenstein. So this is just one example of one company. Granted, it's a very, very big company. It's the biggest Russian company, Gazprom. But according to my good friend Roman, the late great Roman Kuczynski, who passed away several years ago tragically, this Gazprom set up 50 or so companies. Now, if this is just Gazprom, imagine how many more shell companies are set up by other Russian entities. One example of one of these shell companies that Gazprom set up is something I've done a little bit of research on. And the example is this company called Vemex. I wrote about this shell company in a piece I co-authored back in 2010 called "The Velvet Surrender," about how Russia was using these shell companies to influence politics in the Czech Republic. Now, Vemex is a purportedly Czech firm that sells Russian natural gas. It emerged in 2001, seemingly out of nowhere. And it's captured around 10% of the Czech retail gas market. Its ownership structure is essentially indecipherable. It's owned by companies based in Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. One of these Austrian companies is the Centrex Europe Energy and Gas, which was founded by Gazprom's financing arm and registered in Austria, and according to the European Commission, is actually owned by two companies, one registered in Cyprus, and the other by Gazprom's German subsidiary, Gazprom Germania. If you are confused, I certainly hope that's the case, because that's the point. Another example is the aforementioned Vienna-based Centrex Group, which is owned by a Cyprus-based holding company and RN Privatstiftung in Austria, as well as Gazprom's Germania network. So this is the picture that Roman is trying to paint here, this opaque group of shell companies, in this case tied to Gazprom, that are spreading around Europe. Now, these are not just money laundering entities. These are influence spreading entities because every foreign official that's affiliated with these becomes part of this ready-made lobby for Russian interests. If we can go to the next slide, please, I'll kind of continue on this point. This is, I call this Putin's invisible army, the Stasi-Gazprom network, because there is also evidence that Vladimir Putin has recruited some members of his old intelligence network in the East German Stasi to help set up some of these front companies across and throughout Europe. A 2007 investigative report by the German journalist Hans-Martin Tillak, published in the weekly Stern, uncovered how Gazprom Germany was, and I'm quoting, something of a club for former members of the East German security services. This is a story of an invasion, Tillak writes. A massive campaign planned well in advance. The general staff is located far away in the east in Moscow, the capital of Russia. The target area is Germany and the rest of Europe, Tillak writes, rather bombastically, but not at all inaccurately, I would add. He continues, the story of this invasion is teeming with ex-Stasi officers and shady figures. It's a story of letterbox companies that do not even have a letterbox, of companies nestled within companies, the overriding impression that they are concealing the flow of funds. And yes, indeed they are, but again, they are also spreading influence. A couple of things to say about this. This gets around the Federal Republic of Germany's lustration laws, because ex-Stasi officials, of course, are barred from politics, but they're not barred from business. And in this sense, they're not effectively barred from lobbying. They are EU citizens that can basically create stealth Russian front companies across Europe. And this is the case. And we see these front companies being used to further and advance Russian interests in the Czech Republic. I think it's no accident that the current president of the Czech Republic has a lot of Lukoil and Gazprom lobbyists very close to him, and elsewhere in Europe. So this is just, I mean, I'm just scratching the tip of the iceberg today to kind of look at how Russia uses these shell companies and how corruption spreads throughout Europe as a tool of Russian influence. And before I move on to organized crime, I want to remind you of how corruption is used internally inside of Russia. It's a method to control people. Once you have foreign officials ensnared in this web, you effectively have a degree of control over them. This is a form of non-kinetic warfare that the Putin regime is using to undermine Western unity, undermine NATO cohesion, undermine transatlantic unity, undermine European unity, and undermine cohesion within individual states in the Western alliance. So this is not just corruption. This is corruption as a tool of political influence. If we could move to the next slide, please. Now this slide, anybody that's seen last, I'm reusing this one, Truth in Advertising, because I saw a double opportunity to use this. Putin's Mafia, Statecraft, the spook meets the Godfather. This is one of the ways I like to kind of characterize Vladimir Putin. If he is genealogically a product of the KGB, sociologically he's a product of the Wild East and the Russian capital, the Wild East Russian capitalism of the 1990s that was infested with organized crime. The line between organized crime in the state and the state in Russia has always been razor thin, if a line exists at all. As deputy mayor in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, Putin spent a lot of time with gangsters. He collaborated with the infamous Tambovska and Malashevska organized crime groups to help them gain control of St. Petersburg's gaming industry and fuel distribution industry. And I talked about this a bit in my last talk, and I want to kind of talk about it a little bit more now. Putin also used his office to help launder mafia money and to arrange foreign travel for known mobsters. Security at the Ozero Dacha cooperative that he co-founded with many of his former KGB pals was provided by a company run by the Tambov organized crime group, whom Putin helped gain a monopoly over the city's fuel distribution network. Putin was, in fact, an important liaison between the local government and the criminal underworld. And when he moved to the Kremlin, Putin put his old mafia contacts to use as a tool of Russian statecraft. In 2010, the Spanish prosecutor, Jose Grinda Gonzalez, briefed U.S. officials in Madrid and said that Russian authorities used, quote, organized crime groups to do whatever the government of Russia cannot acceptably do as a government. A cable from the U.S. Embassy quoted the prosecutors telling American officials that Putin's Russia was a, quote, virtual mafia state where it was impossible to distinguish between the government's activities and those of organized crime groups. Likewise, in a widely circulated 2017 report, my good friend, the Russian organized crime expert Mark Galeotti, author of the book The Vori, Russia's Super Mafia, noted that, quote, growing evidence of connections between such criminal networks and the Kremlin state security apparatus, notably the Foreign Intelligence Service, military intelligence, and the Federal Security Service. So the SVR, the GRU, and the FSB, for those of you who know your Russian acronyms. Mark also adds that, quote, organized crime groups have already been used by the Kremlin as instruments of intelligence activity and political influence that are likely to become an even greater problem as Russia's campaign to undermine Western unity and effectiveness continues. So how has Putin used organized crime groups towards this end? I mean, there's a lot of mythology that when Putin came to power in 2000 and was promising to pull Russia out of the chaos of the 1990s when organized crime groups were running rampant in Russia, and that he was going to restore order to Russia. This is a lot of mythology, because effectively what Putin did with the organized crime groups with whom he was knee-deep in their activities was basically cut a deal. You can continue being gangsters and doing your gangster stuff, just don't embarrass me and don't embarrass the state, and I am going to periodically need favors from you. I'm going to need you to do things I don't want my fingerprints on, like smuggling arms into the Donbass, for example. I'm going to need you to do other things I don't need my fingerprints on, like committing assassinations abroad. A 2015 report in Bloomberg, for example, looked at how Russian hackers who have been relentlessly hacking Western institutions have been recruited from the criminal underworld. The Russian state security agencies would look into the criminal underworld and find cyber criminals who are effectively, hacking banks and stealing money and pulling off all kinds of phishing schemes, and give them an offer they cannot refuse, right? Either you work for us or you go to prison. If you work for us, to a degree, we're going to let you continue your criminal activities, but you're also going to hack for us. So this is a classic example of this marriage between organized crime and the Russian state. And if we can go to the next slide, please. And this is one of my favorite case studies. Anybody who's seen me speak in the past know I will often bring this up, and my apologies, but I think it's just such an excellent case study, just like the cyber criminals, of how this actually works. In September 2014, an Estonian law enforcement officer by the name of Eston Kohver was abducted on the Estonian side of the Russian-Estonian border and taken into Russia and charged with espionage. The Russian officials incorrectly and falsely accused Kohver of operating on the Russian side of the border, where all of the forensic evidence shows he was clearly abducted on the Estonian side of the border and dragged into Russia. This, by the way, happened while President Barack Obama then President Barack Obama, was in Tallinn on an official visit, meeting with then Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves. And at the time, this was seen as just an effort to embarrass Obama, to show what Russia was able to do to an Estonian law enforcement officer while Obama was in the Estonian capital. And that timing may or may not have been part of Russia's calculations, but there were deeper calculations about the timing of this at work. Kokver worked for effectively what was the Estonian version of the FBI, what is called Kapo, which is the Estonian criminal police. And he was investigating a cigarette smuggling ring run by Russian organized crime groups in eastern Estonia. But this was not just your run-of-the-mill investigation of a cigarette smuggling ring. This was also a counter-espionage investigation, because that cigarette smuggling ring was assisted by the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. And according to Estonian law enforcement, the smugglers were also assisting with intelligence activities. They were surveilling the border, for example. They were gathering information about the movement of military vehicles along the border. They were reporting back to the FSB about the habits of border guards, as well as other intelligence and espionage operations. And perhaps most interestingly, they were generating cash, untraceable black cash, what the Russians call chernaya kassa, or the black cash box, for the Russian intelligence could use for other black operations. So they were generating black cash that could not be traced, right? Because it was coming from illicit cigarette trading across the Russian-Estonian border. This was 2014, I would add, and I think it's also very interesting that around this time, there were a lot of what looked like Russian active measures taking place across Europe that it was really, really hard to trace the financial sources of. And trust me, I tried. For example, a lot of these so-called alternative news sites were popping up in different European cities that were either really outright conspiratorial and ridiculous, or looked respectable, but were sliding in a lot of kind of pro-Kremlin, Eurosceptic, anti-Atlanticist, and anti-American propaganda in between a lot of respectable news. And a lot of us who were working in Europe at the time strongly suspected that these were Russian fronts, but we could never trace the actual source of the funding. And I never was able to put A and B together between things like these cigarette smuggling rings that were generating black cash while surveilling the border and providing the Russian intelligence services with intelligence on the ground, and also generating black cash. I always suspected a connection. I was unfortunately never ever able to kind of establish a clear link between the two, but I still to this day suspect it. And now if we could move to the last slide, and this is just my attempt at a kind of solution, a kind of policy, rex. And these are a work in progress right now. I'm kind of working through these, but I want to kind of present them to you today. And this is a solution that I call hybrid containment. Hybrid has become a favorite buzzword now. I want to attach it to the word containment. And what is hybrid containment? One piece of hybrid containment is doing what NATO and EUCOM does very well in Europe, kind of like, increasing things like enhanced forward presence and protecting, making it clear that the deterrence is real, and we are going to protect our allies in Europe, particularly the Baltic states. But also, I think the other part of hybrid is bringing in things like non-kinetic defense, holistic defense. And part of this is bringing law enforcement, regulatory agencies more closely into the national security discussion. Some of our allies in the Baltic states, like Estonia and Lithuania, are actually doing this very, very well, and I think there's a lot we can learn from them. But bringing law enforcement, regulatory agency, finance much closer into the discussion about law enforcement, expanding national security councils to include these, because let's face it, the military arms of government aren't always equipped to deal with these financial weapons that I discussed earlier on. I've actually suggested that NATO establish ministerials for finance and interior ministries, in addition to the existing defense and foreign ministerials. We also need to tighten up beneficial ownership and money laundering legislation. This legislation was kind of created in an era before Russia weaponized globalization, and I think we need to update it to account for this with an eye toward national security threats. The way I like to kind of sell this is that we need to clean up the city of London and we need to clean up the state of Delaware. So just tighter beneficial ownership and anti-money laundering, and also what I call FARA on steroids, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. Again, something that was created and is is good legislation, but was created in an era before hostile foreign entities were really using globalization as a tool to undermine our Western democratic institutions. Australia provides a very good model to emulate on this, I would add, in terms of a kind of beefed up Foreign Agent Registration Act on steroids. I would also, and this is as I get increasingly radical as I go up my chain here, reestablishing export controls along Cold War era COCOM model. COCOM is the Coordinating Committee for Export Controls, which is a Cold War era institution that forbid the sale of dual-use technology to the Soviet Union or its allies in the Warsaw Pact. Now, this would be a very, 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 very hard sell right now. I think Silicon Valley would scream bloody murder if it weren't able to sell its iPhones in Russia. But I think this is something we actually have to start thinking about, because effectively right now we are allowing Vladimir Putin's Russia to have it both ways. They are getting the fruits and the goodies of a globalized world economy, and that globalized world economy is the product of certain rules about how one conducts oneself in that globalized world economy. But they are getting the goodies and the fruits of that globalized world economy while they are trying to burn down the rules, right? Our assumptions about globalization, going back to my first slide, our assumptions were that if we let Russia into the club, they would abide by the rules of the club. Instead, they are apparently trying to burn down the clubhouse. So this is something we really have to consider. I mean, I understand that this is going to create a lot of consternation in different parts of our economy who want to sell their product in Russia's very large market. And I would add that, we were all doing quite well before we had that market. And I think we can do just as well without it, understanding that this is a radical solution. And I say this is not the first port of call here in terms of this. And there are things that even more radical I would propose. And I would say that things like what I call the kind of nuclear option of a SWIFT ban should be on the table. They should also, of course, not be our first port of call, but banning Russia from the SWIFT payment system is something I guarantee you would get the attention of the Kremlin. This was very effective with Iran, bringing Iran to the table, and it would be very effective in, I think, curbing Russian behavior. I think we have to be very careful about this because a SWIFT ban for Russia would have potentially devastating effects for the European, for specifically the economies of our European allies. Likewise, but I don't think a ban on the buying and selling of Russian sovereign debt should also be on the table. But finally, what I would want to say, and those last 2 points on this slide are in reverse order, and that's my bad. I think we need to establish a almost DEFCON style early warning and escalation and response ladder for non-kinetic threats and aggression from Russia. DEFCON, of course, anybody in the military knows, refers to the escalation ladder up to nuclear war. We have early warning systems for nuclear attacks. We have early warning systems for terrorism, as we should. I would argue we need an early warning system for these kinds of non-kinetic threats that are out there, from weaponized organized crime, from weaponized corruption. So when should red flags go up? When an American businessman is like working with a Russian company and not filing his FBAR to the Internal Revenue Service, for example. Certain red flags should certainly go up in the Internal Revenue Service that this is a potential national security threat. I would argue that certain red flags should be going up in other acronyms in the U.S. Intelligence community, saying this is a potential national security threat. When a cigarette smuggling ring in Eastern Estonia, in our NATO ally, is caught surveilling the border, how much of a red flag should go up about this? Because when we think about these hybrid threats, there are effectively 2 types of hybrid threats, in my opinion. There is one type that is, I call the Ukrainian model, which is preparing a battlefield for kinetic action. And that was what happened in Ukraine. The information war and all of the other non-kinetic things, the cyber attacks, the use of organized crime to destabilize societies, these all happened before the troops moved and the conflict went kinetic. So when is a non-kinetic attack a preparation for kinetic? And this again is back to my idea of a DEFCON escalatory ladder. But then there's another type of non-kinetic action, and that is the use of non-kinetic means against the United States or Germany or other Western countries. This is a long-term political war that's not going to go kinetic anytime soon, but I think we still need to keep our eye on it, and it still can turn into a very, very serious and destabilizing threat. So I think that the establishment of a DEFCON system here is something we have to keep in mind. So that's my kind of, for what it's worth, the outlines of a kind of a hybrid containment policy. And on that note, I'll stop because I'm looking at the clock and see I've again gone 5 minutes over. So that's my bad. I apologize to Phil and to RSI and to UCOM. We can open it up now, and back to you, Phil.
Brian, thanks for that. Don't worry about going over time because it was all truly illuminating stuff. In a sense, I felt like I was reading sort of the plot lines of either a Mario Puzo novel or a Jean le Carré novel. Either way, the story writes itself. And when you're talking about this stuff, I caught early on. If you don't mind, I'll just lead off with a question as folks are typing their questions in. But I kind of caught early on the whiff of what seems to be a bit of a life support system for this whole apparatus, and that is people with a certain skill set who grew up with Putin in his early days, especially with the Stasi and KGB. They are all getting older and probably moving on. Is there another generation of, say, similarly skilled individuals who are coming in behind this group of people to carry on the business, as it were?
Yes, and I would actually argue that the younger generation is coming in with actually an even better skill set. Because while Putin and his generation were socialized entirely in the Soviet system, right? And they knew this kind of corrupt systema that actually resembles kind of an organized crime family in a lot of ways. While they were well steeped in that, this new generation understands Western marketing techniques. It understands Western pop culture and subcultures, right? This is again, the dark side of globalization, where they have been integrated into Western institutions, and therefore they understand our institutions a lot as well as we do, and understand how to undermine them. And the Putin regime is very actively recruiting these folks. I did a blog post back in, it must have been 2012 or so, about how the Kremlin was recruiting the next generation of mid-level bureaucrats that would become the rising generation in the elite. And they were going out into the provinces and trying to find people who were ideologically in line with Putin, and giving them opportunities and bringing them to Moscow. Right? If you think about my discussion of the hackers and the cyber criminals, and how they are largely recruited from the criminal underworld, these are not old guys, right? These are young men and women, very young men and women, who kind of grew up. These are Russian millennials and Russian Gen Zers, right? These are not baby boomers and Gen Xers. So to answer your question, and it's actually very disturbing, and it's actually an interesting area for research. Many of you may have seen the excellent research my SIPA colleague Maria Smegovaya is doing on the new generation in Russia, and how this generation is much more democratic and pro-Western in its orientation. And I'm always arguing the counterpoint, because although I'm an optimist by nature, at my age, you can't help but be a little bit pessimistic, especially in this day and age. And I say, I worry that this next generation is going to be less democratic and actually much more skilled at undermining democracy than its forebears. So that's an excellent question, Phil. And I think this is an area of research about the dark side of the next generation, and it doesn't even have to, I mean, I think Maria's right. I think the majority of the younger generation in Russia does want to partake in the fruits of globalization, and is more pluralistic and democratic in its outlook. But it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't have to be a majority. You just have to be able to recruit enough who are basically savvy in this social media world now, and savvy about Western subcultures and pop cultures, and know how to undermine it. It's kind of like a Gen Z version of the TV show The Americans, right? It's that there were people that basically are very in tune with Western culture. So yeah, that's how I'd answer that. Excellent question, Phil.
Thanks, by the way. Love the show, and it seems like that sort of expertise is certainly asymmetric in its own way. So thank you for that. I turn it over to the Q&A board. We've got a few questions lined up. Frank D, I believe we answered your questions on what we can do about going beyond admiring the problem during the presentation. Thank you for being the vanguard of the question askers. I do have one from F. O'Reilly, who thanks for the overview. Do you see the decline of surplus oil and gas rents as impacting on the ability to use corruption as a tool for influence at home and in Europe?
That's also an excellent question, and the answer, I mean, I've been wrong on this before. I mean, I've been wrong and I've been right on this before. I mean, the short answer is yes, because the Russian economy, all of the money that fuels this corruption, is generated largely by oil and gas. The Russian as the late great Marshall Goldman, formerly of the Harvard Russian Research Center, once said, the Russian economy rests on two important pillars: oil and gas. And this is actually, and so as oil and gas become less important, there is less money to go around. Now, Russia also makes a fair bit of money from the arms trade. And if you look at the kind of clan structure at the highest level of the Kremlin, it's no accident that Sergei Chemezov and Igor Sechin, who are, oversee those two sectors, are two of the most important heads of clans, informal clans in the Kremlin. So the decline of oil and gas, I think, has the potential to diminish this. The last time we had an oil glut, it contributed to the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. So whether or not this is going to happen this time, I don't know, but it certainly should. And this gets into something I discussed last week. It's the kind of paradox of modernization in Russia. Every serious economist in Russia will say that Russia needs to diversify its economy beyond hydrocarbons, and it has in order to survive. But every serious political scientist will tell you that Russia can't and won't do this because decentralizing and diversifying the economy away from hydrocarbons will create kind of decentralized centers of economic power that the Kremlin cannot control, that can turn into political centers of power. So the economic decentralization and diversification could lead to a political decentralization and diversification, which is politically unacceptable to the Kremlin. I call this the paradox of modernization. They've never been able to get around this. But so the short answer to this question is yes, I do think it will undermine it. But for the time being, Russia still has sufficient reserves to be able to weaponize corruption into the foreseeable future. In the long run, yes, this is going to be a problem.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, and thanks, F. O'Reilly. Our next one is from Andrew M., who, based on your last slide, he says, your suggestions are not radical. They are, in his opinion, a necessary baseline to deal with the mechanics of whole of society warfare as practiced by the Kremlin. He comments that NATO and the US need to reorganize and prioritize assets and funding in order to counter and preempt Russian methods, similar to what you described in your last slide, Brian. But he asks, what touch points and key leaders in the US and EU are presently amenable to addressing these threats appropriately?
I mean, I think there is a lobby in the US, in the EU for this. At the time, currently, it's a minority, right? I'm going to kind of refrain from mentioning specific leaders because I do work for a nonpartisan nonprofit, and I want to be careful about being accused of being political in this. But I will say this, that this discussion about national security and Russian non-kinetic aggression has become unduly politicized on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think we need to get back to a place where this is a nonpartisan and bipartisan discussion about this. I think we need to forge a consensus around this. One of the other things I've been doing as I kind of work my way through a lot of this is going back and reading the history of the early Cold War and how leaders like Truman and Churchill and Adenauer were able to forge a consensus in Western societies about the threat that we faced and what we were going to do together in order to contain it. And I think we need to have that similar effort now because there are leaders on both sides of the Atlantic who get this. If you talk to people in the foreign ministries of Lithuania or Estonia, for example, you're going to talk to a bunch of people who effectively get this, right? If you talk to people in certain political parties in other Western European countries on the far left or the far right, you're not going to get people you're going to get people who refuse or are unwilling or unable to get this. So I think a lot of work needs to be done at reforging a consensus. And a part of doing this is not just the negative consensus, but the positive consensus. I mean, we in the West, on both sides of the Atlantic, have forgotten how to tell our Western story. We've forgotten how to believe in our Western story again. Stories are very powerful things. I'm a big fan of the Israeli historian Yuval Harari, who makes this argument in his book Sapiens, that humans are essentially storytellers. And without storytelling, we're not human. And without storytelling, sapiens would never have become the dominant species on planet Earth, because they first developed the art of storytelling. Right? Without storytelling, our institutions are meaningless. Without storytelling, money is just a piece of paper with a picture of a famous dead person on it. With storytelling, and when we believe in the story of money's values or institutions' values, then these things become reified and become very powerful. We've forgotten how to tell the story of our Western civilization and the story of our Western democracy and the power of it. And I think forging this consensus has to go hand in hand with kind of reforging this belief in our Western institutions. We're in this age of cynicism, and we're in this age of lazy relativism right now, where and this is exactly what the Putin regime wants us to think. Yeah, everybody's corrupt, everybody's dirty, we're just doing what you're doing, you're no better than us. Well, I would argue, yes, we are, because of our institutions, because of what our Western story and our Western democracy means. And I think we need to relearn that story in order to forge the consensus, so these things that I'm proposing are not so radical anymore, because money's not neutral. Capital is not politically neutral. Capital can be used as a weapon, and it's being used as a weapon right now. And I think we have to be very, very mindful of that. So thank you for that excellent question.
Wonderful. Yeah, it sounds like as much as a criminal and financial intelligence aspect plays into all this, of course, information operations is alive and well in that storytelling and narrative piece. So thanks for that answer. Our next comes from somebody called Tracyroo, who asks, can you share your thoughts on the use of private military corporations, PMCs, in the context of your talk today? Not the details of the operational use, but as an arm of the dark ecosystem. And I was actually kind of wondering the same thing, Brian, as you were talking. It seems like this is another tool that insulates Putin from doing dirty work. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the private military groups like Wagner, I see this as essentially basically the formalization of a lot of criminal networks. Effectively, it's kind of like the organized crime going semi-legit. I mean, that's how I would see this. I mean, this is Prigozhin, Putin's chef, is the curator of some of these groups, and this again, that's basically what I can say about it. I mean, the problem with this, to a degree, for Putin, is that the mask is kind of off. This doesn't really offer any plausible deniability that anybody really knows about, really believes, because everybody that's paying attention effectively knows that these these groups are arms of the Russian state, even though they are not state groups, right? But that's what I would say. I mean, that's how I would fit them into this kind of scheme. I don't know enough about the minutia of their actual activities, but this insulates Putin not just internationally but domestically, because the last thing he wants to see from his military adventures abroad is something that the Russian public is kind of losing its stomach for, is body bags of Russian soldiers coming home. If this is conducted by private firms, Putin can sort of truthfully say, well, there's not really that many Russian soldiers operating abroad, when in fact there are. They're effectively mercenaries of the state. But yeah, these are organized crime groups gone legit with very, very high level military training. That's what I would add. And I would also add that the line between organized crime, the intelligence services, and parts of the armed forces are very blurred, in the sense that people are moving between these entities. And there's actually a lot of room for good forensic research to be done on that in terms of the actual movement of personnel, that these are just not in spirit, but actually are quite literally, a lot of times the same people. I apologize, Tracy, if I didn't answer that in enough detail. I try not to go in areas where I'm don't feel I have sufficient expertise so I kind of left it at that. I hope that addressed your question.
Ryan, I think you addressed it just fine, especially from the perspective of the home front and the way that Putin is allowed to stay that ostensibly there are no Russian soldiers operating abroad, or fewer than it appears. Folks, we are running a little bit short on time, and so if you are asking a question, please don't hesitate. We'll try to get you answers to them after the broadcast here. But I do have one, and I think it's probably a good one to kind of wrap up on. Anonymously submitted, this person wants to know what, if any, books or resources you would recommend to learn more about Russian black economic activity.
Well, there's Karen Dawish's Putin's Kleptocracy, which I think is just a fantastic book on this. Now, Karen and I were talking. She again passed away, and God rest her soul. We miss her a lot. She passed away a few years back, but when she was researching this book, she and I were talking quite a bit. And a lot of, she flattered me to no end by saying that she kind of drew a lot from my work as a journalist in St. Petersburg in the 1990s about this, but she took this farther than I ever dared or could. So that would be number one on my list. Number two, and not even number two, I would actually a number one would be another book by my very good friend and former podcast co-host Mark Galeotti, The Vody, Russia's Super Mafia, which takes a look at the organized crime piece. And back in 2017, Mark also did a report for the European Council on Foreign Relations that looks at this. But if you really, the Vody is, it's just a beautifully written book. And that just grips you from the first page. You start reading this book, and just to give a little tease here, you have, it opens with a body washing on the shores of Leningrad in the 1970s, and the Soviet police, the militia, they can't identify the body because all identifying marks have been destroyed, the fingerprints and everything else. And they were able to figure out exactly who this was from the tattoos on his body, because each tattoo tells a story about what organized crime group you belong to, when you served in prison, and where and for what, and what level you were in organized crime. It was kind of like your curriculum vitae on your body in your tattoos, and exactly from the tattoos, Russian law enforcement was able to identify the person. And Mark uses this as a metaphor for kind of organized crime being kind of a CV of post-Soviet Russia. So I would, again, couldn't recommend this enough. Another one I'm really looking forward to that's about to come out, and somebody, Catherine Belton, if you're out there, we were colleagues at the Moscow Times back in the 90s. I'm really looking forward to your book, Putin's People, which effectively looks at the use of Putin's use of corruption and organized crime against the West. It's another one of these books that I wish I had written, but one of my colleagues beat me to the punch because they are much more disciplined and have a better work ethic than I'll ever have. Catherine Belton's Putin's People is something I would certainly recommend. Those are three that just kind of come to mind just off the top of my head. I'd be glad to kind of provide more in the written section afterwards, but I'm looking at the clock as well as you are, Phil, and I see we're pushing up against it.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that answer, and thanks for that question. We're always looking for good things to read here. So other questions out there concerning cryptocurrency, SWIFT, and the like, again, we'll try to get answers to those after the show. But Ryan, as always, I can't thank you enough for your insights today, and this has been really illuminating. I swear, every time I hear stuff like this, it sounds almost like a screenplay to a movie. It's just so outsized. and that it actually does exist out there. For the rest of the group, look, we're taking a knee next Thursday, but we are going to push a Project Connect on Wednesday. So instead of our usual Thursday venue, we've moved it to Wednesday. So we hope, as always, to see you there at 1500 Central European time. Between now and then, if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to check out Brian Whitmore's podcast, The Power Vertical, from SEPA, and that is available where all podcasts are downloadable from. With that, Brian, any closing comments?
No, thank you very much. It's an honor to be doing this with you guys. I'm glad I'm always available in the future and glad to help. And again, any questions I didn't answer, I know we can jump on them in the written format after the fact. Apologize if I wasn't on top of my game today. I didn't get the best night's sleep last night, but sometimes that happens.
Couldn't tell, Brian. Thanks again, and thanks everybody for dialing in, and we'll catch all of you next time. Thanks a lot.